do a tutorial here, and we are basically going to make a simple dice rolling program. We're going to head over to Replit. We're going to click, I'll just do that one more time. We're going to click New REPL at the top left. We're going to choose Python. We're going to call this the Dice Roller. And we're going to create REPL. So this is our fresh, clean, crisp REPL right here. Left side is going to be my files. This is where I'm entering my code. This is the console. So this is going to show any output that we have from our code. Okay, so first thing we are going to do, and actually before we do that, can everybody please do me a favor? Or, since I'm recording this, one thing to make this look a little cleaner and easier to see is go over to the settings icon right here, this little gear icon. Change your indent size to 4, and then also change your font size to large. It's just going to make it a little easier to see, and the indents are going to be a lot clearer. Okay, so the first thing we are going to do, so we are making a dice rolling program. Okay, we're making a dice rolling program. And the very first thing I want to do, I actually want to create a function, because I like using functions because they're cleaner, and it helps to organize your program a little bit, makes it easy to read. And if I need to make any changes, I can actually make changes in the function and not later on in my program. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function that rolls the dice. Okay, so I'm going to create a function that rolls the dice. And I'm also going to give a couple parameters for the user so that the user can actually choose how many dice they want and also how many sides they want on the dice or on the die, for example. So whenever I create a function, I have to use the keyword def. It stands for define. So I'm going to type in that def keyword, and then I'm just going to call this function roll dice. Now remember, I'm totally making up this word. This is not built into Python. That's why I have to define it, right? Something like print, this print function right here, that's already built into Python. I don't need to tell Python what print does. Python already knows. But it does not know what roll dice means. So I have to tell Python what it means. And don't forget, anytime I create a function, I've got to put a colon. Colon tells Python that anything coming after the colon is part of the function. However, I also need to indent. So if you're not indented, Python does not read this as being part of the function. So we got roll dice. What we're going to do is I'm going to give it 2 parameters. And again, I am totally making these things up because we're going to tell Python what they mean in the function. So the first one is I want to say num of dice. I want the number of dice as 1 parameter, and I also want num of sides as my second parameter. Again, these are I just made these up. These are placeholders for later on when I call my roll function. I'm going to enter a number here and here. And because I tell Python what to do with these things, the function will know what to do. Okay, so here we go. So in order to roll dice, I need to use a random number generator. So what I actually need to do in order to get a random number generator, I need to import the random library. Now, random is actually built into Python, but it doesn't come stock in this little file here because there's a lot of functionality in Python, and if Python loaded with all of its functionality, it would be very slow. So Python only gives you a few things that are always needed, and then if you want anything else, you got to import it in. So we are going to import a library called random. And random has a bunch of cool functions inside it. The one we're going to use is generating random numbers. Okay, so back down here in my function, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list. And I'm going to call this list dice. But I'm going to make the list empty. So by opening and closing brackets like this with nothing inside, I'm telling Python that this thing called dice is actually a list, and it's an empty list. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to add however many dice the user wants to roll, and however many sides there are, I want to add those numbers to the list. Okay, so here's how I do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a loop, actually. And I'm creating a loop because I don't know how many times I want to do this. It's up to the user. So I'm going to say for I, and I is going to stand for iteration. So iteration is just the number of times this function is going to run. So for I in range. And range means I'm going to run it for X number of times, or I number of times. And I actually want to do that. What I'm going to put in here is number of dice. And the reason I do that is, let's say the user wants to roll 3 dice, or wants three dice. I want my program to generate 3 numbers. So that's why I choose the same number. So for I in range, whatever the user types in, for I in range, whatever the user types in, I am going to add a number to my list. So dice. Now I'm going to use this function. It's called append. What append does, append is built into the list library, or the list object. And what append does is it sticks things onto the end of a list. So it's going to append something. And here's what I want it to append. I want it to append a random, coming from the random library, dot randint. That is picking a random integer in a range between A and B, just like it says right here. Okay, I always want my dice to start at 1, because there's no side 0 on a die. So there's going to be 1. And it's going to go up to whatever the user wants. So num of sides. So for I in range, whatever the user types in, it's going to add a random number between 1 and however many sides we want on our die. It's going to add it to the list. Once that's done, what I want to do, I just want to print it out so I can see what it looks like. So I'm going to print the list called dice. And then I also need to return dice. This part is really, really important. The reason it's important is when you run this function called rolldice, it's going to create whatever you say is returned here. So when I run this function, it is going to create a list for me. And I can now use that list in my program. Okay, so I'm going to run this, make sure there's no errors. Okay, good. Now let's run our function and see what happens. So now you'll notice I'm outside of my function. So if I hide that, I'm no longer tabbed in. I'm outside of my function. So let's run this. I'm just gonna go like this. It's called rolldice. That's our function. And number of dice. Let's say we want 4 dice, and we want them to have 6 sides each. So I'm giving it 2 numbers. And you'll see that that is printing out a list. And every time I run it, it's going to give me different numbers. I got 4 dice, and each one has 6 sides. I could change this. Maybe you just want 2 dice, but you want an 8-sided die. Just change the numbers. And now I've got 2 dies with random numbers between 1 and 8. But just one thing, right? So this is a function. This is creating a list. In order for me to use this later on in my program, I actually need to give it a name because this is just a function. It hasn't actually created the official list yet. The only reason you're seeing it here is because I have a print statement here, right? So I don't actually need that print statement. So what I'm going to do is just hide it for a second. So you'll see when I run the program, you don't see anything. However, I'm going to just I'm going to call this function something else. So I'm going to call it, I'll just call it my dice, and it equals this function. So I'm going to run. You're not going to see anything again. However, if I now print out my dice, you should see the dice there, okay? So the return statement is very important because it tells Python what you're actually doing with that function. You want it to be a list. That's why I return dice, because dice is my list. Okay, so we got the function. Everything's good. What I need to do now is I need to actually create the program part. I need to ask the user if they want to roll the dice. I'm going to let them roll as long as they type in the number 1. But if they type in a 0, the program's going to end. Okay? So here's how we do this. I'm going to delete the print. No, I'll just leave that there for a second. Actually, no, I'm going to delete it. Okay. So here's what I do now. I need to create a loop. And I'm actually going to use a while loop. And I'm going to use this thing called while true. What while true is, this is an infinite loop. Okay? And here's what an infinite loop means. So if I say while true, I'm going to do, I'll create my list of dice. I'll call my function roll dice. I'll say I want 3 dice, each with 6 sides. And then I'm gonna print out my dice. Print my dice. This is inside a while loop because I've got my while loop here and I'm tabbed in. So you'll see that this is gonna go on forever, right? Because it's a while loop, right? And it's a while true. So this is an infinite loop. It's gonna keep going forever and ever and ever and possibly crash your computer. Obviously, we don't want it to do that. So here's what we're gonna do. And just follow along with me on this part. And then if you get stuck, just pause the video, go back, and then, check again what I'm doing and then keep going. Okay, so we're going to say while true, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to create a variable called answer. And I'm going to say input, because I'm asking the user for some input. I'm going to say, do you want to roll the dice? Do you want to roll the dice? Type 1 to roll or 0 to quit. Okay? So if I run this, yeah, it'll ask me this, right? So I can just type 1. It's just going to keep going, right? It doesn't matter because I haven't told it anything else to do. So do you want to roll the dice? Type 1 to roll or 0 to quit. Now, here's where it gets tricky. So remember, if I use an input function, whatever I type in when I say input right here, so whatever I type in here, Python thinks it's a string. That means it does not think it's a number. They just think it's letters, words, symbols, something like that. I want it to be a number though. So here's what I do. So I'm going to say if answer, which is what the user types in, and I'm going to use this function. It's called isDigit. What that does is it checks to see if the string that you just typed in is actually a number. The reason we do this is because if we don't, and the user types in a string by accident, it can crash the program. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I force the user to type in a number by doing this. Okay, so let's say I'm forcing the user to type in a number. Let me run this again. I can type in 1. Okay, that works. 0. Okay. But look what happens when I type in a letter. My program crashes. I don't want this program to crash anytime you type in the wrong thing. So that's why I don't force them to enter a number. Instead, what I do is I say if the answer that they type in is digit. What isDigit does is it sees if the string is actually a number. Okay? If it's a number, if answer.isDigit, we take answer and we force it to be an int or a number. So if the user actually types in a number, right, we'll check to see, is that an actual number? Okay. If it's a number, we want it to actually change into a number. However, if it's not a number, so else, we're going to do this. We're going to say print, that's not a number. Please try again. Okay? Because we don't want this to crash our program. Now, I'm going to use this keyword. It's called continue. What it does when you're inside an infinite loop or any loop, when you type continue, it goes back up to the top of the loop and then it just repeats again. So let's see what happens when we run this. I'm going to type in 1. Okay, 1 and 0 all work, and actually 5 works. But if I type in A, it'll say that's not a number. Please try again. And just to make this look clean, I'm going to put a /n in front of the word inside the quotation marks, and then 1 at the end inside the quotation marks. And what that does is it just prints space. So watch, I'll type in A, that's not a number, please try again, and then it just opens it up so I've got some space there. Okay, so far so good. Our program's not crashing. However, I only want the answer 1 or 0. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say if answer double equals, because I'm comparing, if answer equals 1, this is where I'm going to have it run the program. Okay? And so what I'll do, I'm going to say if answer equals 1, I'm going to say break. What that does is it breaks us out of this while true loop. Okay? And then what I can do is I can say else, because all they can type in, actually no, I'm going to say not else. I'm going to say, so if it equals 1, do that. And then I'm going to say elif answer equals 0. And if answer equals 0, I'm also going to say break. So if it's 1, break. Else if, so if it's not 1, check to see if it's 0. If it's 0, also break. And then else, if it's any other number, I want to say this. Print, please enter a 1 or 0 only. And then I'm going to use continue again, because this is going to go back up to the top and try it again. Now, I'm just going to show you what happens when you break. So I'm going to put this here. I'm going to put break. Once you're out of the loop, it's going to do what's outside the loop, which is print break. So take a look. Do you want to roll the dice? I'll say 1. Okay, it breaks, right? So it broke out of the loop. Do you want to roll the dice? I'll type 0. It broke out of the loop. If I type A, That's not a number. Try again. How about T? Not a number. Try again. Let's say I type 6. Please enter a 1 or 0 only. Okay, so look, I'm going to put a /n as well in here, just so it spaces it out real nice. So again, if they don't type in a 1 or a 0, it's going to go back up to the top. So if they type a 1, what we want them to do is, so if they enter a 1, we want the program to roll the dice, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if answer equals 1, right? So we know that if the answer equals 1, it's going to break. And then we're just going to check again, is it a 1 or a 0? So if it's a 1, this is where we're going to roll our dice. So the way I'm going to do that is I am going to create a new object. We'll call it user dice. Because in order for this to work, I need to run my function, because if you remember, my function is returning a list. So when I run this function, or when I call this function, I need to I need to save it somewhere. Because it's returning a list, I need that list to be saved somewhere. And so what I'm going to do is save it just as user dice. And don't forget, I need 2 numbers as input. But I actually want to let the user choose how many dice they want. So num of dice. And I also want them to choose how many sides they want. So first off, I'm just going to check this real quick. And you can see that that is not running. Now, if I put the print back in, let me just test to make sure that's working. Okay, so it did roll, and it rolled 1 die with a number of sides 6, so it's going to pick a random number between 1 and 6, including both 1 and 6. So that is working. And I'll just get rid of that print function again. Just want to hide that for a second. So in order for me to ask them for the input, what I'll do is I'll come down here and I'm going to create 2 new variables. I'll call one, I'll just use the same thing I used above. And I can use num of dice again, because even though it's up here in the function, because I'm defining the function up here, these variables and all of the terminology that I use up here is not available outside of this function, outside of the definition. So I can reuse num of dice. So I'm going to use num of dice, and I'm going to say input. And actually for this one, just for the sake of time, I'll say int, because it has to be an int. And remember, because I'm not doing this up here, what I did in this loop, if the user types in something that's not an int, it's going to crash the program. So that's one of the drawbacks. But just for the sake of time, just to show you, we're going to do it this way. And we'll say, please enter the number of dice you want to roll. Please enter the number of dice you want to roll. And then I'll do the same thing again, but this time I'm going to use, I want number of sides. So we'll say num of sides equals, I'm going to use an integer. I'm going to use input. I'm going to say, how many sides would you, or I'll say, please enter. Please enter the number of sides you would like for your dice. You could say dice or whatever. Dice. Okay. So then, instead of using 1 and 6 here, I'm just going to use num of dice right here, because that's the number of dice they're going to roll. And then I'll use num of sides right there. So now if I run this, let's just make sure this works. So I'm going to type in 1. Okay, not a number. How about 9? Nope, not a number. 0, nothing happens because I haven't told it what to do. It just breaks. And 1. So please enter the number of dice you want to roll. Let's say I want to roll 3 dice. I want them to be normal dice, so I have 6 sides. And you'll see nothing happens. So let's put our print statement back in and just make sure this is working. So say 1 again. I'll do 3. Number of dice 6. Okay, so it did roll the dice right there. But now, of course, the program is over. And so we do want this to keep rolling each time. Now, again, there's a couple ways you could do this, right? You could make it so that just this part keeps looping so that the user doesn't have to enter every time how many dice they want to roll and how many sides. But again, for the sake of time, we'll just make it so that just this part is going to repeat itself. So let's do that. So let's actually come up here. I'm going to highlight this block of code, and I'm actually going to tab it in. And the reason I'm going to tab it is because I'm going to put another loop here. And I'm going to put a while true loop because I want this to run. I want this to run nonstop until the user types 0. So basically, they're going to roll the dice here. And actually, what I'll have them do, I'll have it print user dice down here so that you actually get to see the dice. I'll get rid of it up here. I just had this print statement just to make sure it was working, more of a test. So I'll comment that out. We'll print the user dice down there. Let's make sure this works real quick. Okay, so that still works. It's going to ask, do you want to do it again? And we'll roll, let's see, 3. We'll do something different this time. 2 with sides of 10. Okay, so that is working. It keeps looping, which is good. And also what I want to do probably is after the dice, I'm just going to print a break. And I can do that by putting a /n inside of some quotation marks. Just check that again real quick. Let's say 3 dice with 7 sides. Cool. Okay, so it rolled, and then it asks us for another one. So one thing I do want to do, though, is after it does this, after it prints out the our list there, our list of numbers, I actually want to do something like this. I want to say, we'll let them keep rolling, but I do want to say, do you want to continue rolling or quit? And so what I can do here is I can come in here and say now, let's create one more variable. I'll call it continue game or continue roll. Continue roll equals, and I'm going to do an int again, and I'm going to do some input, and I'm going to say something like type 1 to continue or 0 to quit. And then I'm going to say inside of this first if statement, so inside of this first if statement, I'm going to say if continue roll is equal to 1, then I'm going to use the continue keyword again. So that's going to send this back up to the top of this list. Okay. However, and again, I'm making this just for the sake of time to be a little simpler, but you would probably want to do something like we did up here, just to make sure that they're only typing in a 1 or a 0. And also that if they type in something that's not a number, that the program doesn't crash. But just for this, we will do it this way. So for this one, I'm going to say else if continue roll, else if equal to 0, we are going to say break. So we're going to break out of this loop here. Else, last but not least, we're going to print, maybe do a print statement and say, please choose, or please enter a 1 or 0 only. And then again, we will continue back up to the top of this loop. Okay, so far so good. However, just remember, right? We currently have, so when this, our top loop is running, if we type 1, we're gonna break to here. If we type 0, we're gonna break to here. So that's all fine. But you'll notice that in here, I've got an if statement for for 1 rather. I also want an if statement for the 0. I also want an if statement for the 0. So I'm actually going to come down and I'm going to line up my code, or this next line of code, with the first if statement. And I'm just going to use a plain if, because I don't have an else if and I don't have an else for this one. I just have an if, so I'm going to say if answer equals 0. That means that up here they said they wanted to quit. So if they want to quit, this is also going to break, and it's going to come down to it's going to go outside of the loop, and it's going to execute whatever happens outside of the loop. So I'll say something like, thanks for rolling. See you next time. All right, let's see what happens there. All right, so we'll run it from the beginning. Let's say we type 0. Okay, it says, thanks for rolling, see you next time. Okay, that works. How about 1? It's not a number, try again, okay. Oops, my bad. Let's type 1 again. Okay, not a number, let's maybe type 8. Okay, how about -1? Darn, okay, well, let's say 1. Cool, so it says how many, enter the number of dice you want to roll. Let's say we roll 3. We want them to have 9 sides. There is our dice right there, 2, 5, and 3. Well, let's continue. So I'll type 1, and it should ask me this again. So let's do 5 dice this time with 6 sides, normal dice. All right, 5 dice, it rolled. Let's say I'm like, okay, I'm good now. The 0 will exit it out. So that is looking pretty good. That is looking pretty good. I kind of like the way it's lined up, but if you wanted to go in and just change up your break statements, maybe make it look better for you, you can definitely do that. But otherwise, this is working pretty well. So what I'll do, I'll just run through the loop, or I'll run through the code again really quickly so you can take a look at it. Be sure to pause this video and just make sure your code looks like mine. But one thing before I go through it, just remember this loop right here is basically making sure that I'm only entering a 1 or a 0. This loop right here is showing making sure that I only enter a 1 or a 0 and nothing else. I don't do that down here. So there are parts where the code can crash. So for example, the code's not going to crash up here because I have this loop that's making sure it doesn't crash. But let's say I come down here now. If I type in, how many dice do you want? I'll say 3. That's going to crash my program. And it's because where it says, please enter the number of dice you want to roll. If you look here, I'm requiring an int. So if I don't type in an integer, it's going to crash. So if you wanted to put this style of loop into this part, you definitely could do that. There's also another way to do it using a keyword called try. But we won't get into that in this video. but I just made it this way just for the sake of time. But just bear in mind, it will crash if you don't enter an int when you have an input that's wrapped in an int. So, okay, so just to recap real quick, we started off by creating, well, actually we started off by importing random because we're rolling dice. We want random numbers. We then create a function. We called it rolldice, and I create a function by using the def keyword. Now this function had two parameters. One is going to be num of dice, so the number of dice the user wants to roll. The other is going to be how many sides the user wants to roll. Now remember, I totally made these terms up. These are just placeholders to indicate to Python that something is going to be typed in here and here. And then because I'm defining my function, I tell Python what these two things actually do, which we'll get into down here. So the next part, I create an empty list called dice. Then I created a loop because I want this loop to run however many times, or I want it to run for however many dice there are. So I say for I in range, and I use whatever the user types in here. So Python doesn't even know what this is. It just knows that because I'm saying range, this must be a number. So it's going to run for X number of times. And then we take our list called dice. We use the method or function called append, which adds this number to the list. And I'm adding random.randint. And now my dice are always going to start at 1. So I always just put a 1 there because the dice can't have 0 sides. So it's got at least one side. And then I use the second input from my function or parameter, which is the number of sides. So this is going to pick however many dice they want. And then it's going to pick a random number between 1 and however many sides the user wants. And then last but not least, I have to return the list that I just created. Because what that means is when I run this function, Python is going to create a list. So when you run this function, it creates the list. However, you do need to save that somewhere. And if you remember down here, I actually, where is it? I saved it to something called user dice. So I created my list by running the function right here. And I saved that list to this variable here, user dice. So that was our function. Then next, I created an infinite loop using the while true line of code. And what this infinite loop is doing, it's making sure that the user enters either a 1 or 0 only. So first part, I created a variable called answer. I said input, do you want to roll the dice? 1 to roll, 0 to quit. If that answer, and I ran this function called isDigit. You can run this on a string, and remember answer is a string because I just used the input function. So I say if the answer is actually a number, right? It's a string right here, but Python checks to see if it is actually a number. If it is, we force that string into an int or an integer. So answer now becomes integer. If not, if this is not a number, it's going to say, nope, not a number, please try again. And it goes back up to the top. That's what the continue does. So that way your program does not crash. Now, if it is a number, it's going to check and say, okay, if it's 1 that they do enter, right? So if it's 1, it's going to go down to this loop. It's going to break out of this while infinite loop and come to this one. Else if it's not 1, but a 0, it's also going to break out and come down here. However, if it's not a 1 or a 0, that means you typed in a number that's not 1 or 0. So it's going to go back up to the top and do it again. If you did type a 1 or a 0, it enters this loop now because it comes right after the first one. And again, we have an infinite loop because it's while true. So here I say, well, if the number that they entered is y, we're going to ask the user, please enter the number of dice you want to roll, and also please enter the number of sides. We save them as these two variables. Just remember, these two variables are the same as what I wrote up here, But these things up here where I created my function, these are not available outside of this definition. These don't exist outside. So I'm allowed to use them again down here. And that's why I use them again. So then what I do is I created a new variable called userDice. I ran my function here, and I used the variable from right here, the number of dice the user wants, and then the number of sides. Then I printed that list. So that prints the dice. Then I printed a break, and then I come down here, and this is still in the if statement. This is only if they typed I. And then created a new variable called continue roll, and I said, hey, look, type 1 to continue or 0 to quit. If you type 1, the loop goes right back up here, starts again. However, if you type 0, we break and come down out of the loop down here to line 50 because it says quit, so it prints, thanks for rolling, see you next time. Otherwise, so else, that means they didn't type a 1 or a 0. It'll go back up and ask. It'll go actually all the way back up. Ooh, that's a good point, actually. So this will go all the way back up to here. So that is one kind of missing thing there. So like, let me show you what happens. So if I type 1, we'll roll some dice. Let's say I want to continue. Let's say I type a 9. So yeah, it does not work actually. So it does print please enter a 1 or a 0 only, but then it just goes right back up and restarts here. So this is this is going to cause an error. You'd need to add a little bit more here, but just for the sake of this tutorial, let's not worry about that part. Let's just assume the user types in at least a 1 or a 0. And then of course, if they do type a 0, it's going to break and it's going to break out and print this bottom line. So in a nutshell, that goes over really how to create a function and how to add some variables or some parameters to it. And you can see how those parameters really customize what your function can do. And then we also looked at some different loops and how to make it so that we don't crash our programs. And yeah, we made a simple dice roll program. Thanks for watching. Drop any comments, suggestions in the comments box below. Otherwise, I will see you next time.